Go ahead. Make my day.
Of course, seeing violence in movies and violence on television affects people. Look around you.
Rated R! Top of the world!
No, cinema violence has nothing to do with societal violence whatsoever.
Are you coming out or do you want to be carried out?
I think these films are a way to address our baser impulses without actually going out and braining somebody.
If you show people exciting movies, they'll get excited. You show people violent movies and they'll get charged up.
It's a curious fact that most people think that today is one of the most violent eras in human history. When, to the contrary, in the United States, it's one of the least violent eras in human history.
Violence is nothing new, and it goes back to the Old Testament. Some of the violent acts are just almost unheard of.
Henry V's pretty violent. Richard III's pretty violent. Hamlet's pretty violent. Macbeth's pretty violent.
There was a psychiatrist in the 1950s who testified before Congress. He said that comic books taught children all manner of crime, how to rape little girls and how to steal and forge and rob. If you want to prepare a way for children to learn crime, he said, just simply let them read comic books.
Because at the time we had comics like The Vault of Horror and The Crypt of Terror, and there were disembowelments. This was supposed to have a bad effect and make a bad impression on the young and teenagers. Nothing of the kind. I remember the bloodier and gorier, the more satisfying it was.
Cinema has always been violent. If you see the sea battle in Ben-Hur, the original Ben-Hur, it's one of the most violent things you've ever seen. I mean, people are obviously being killed while you watch it. I mean, they're being hacked down and crushed and everything else. So it's really one of the most violent things I've ever seen on the screen. So it's nothing new.
The late 60s, early 70s cop movies were violent in ways that nobody had ever really seen. Of course, the violence in American cinema took off in 1967 with the release of Bonnie and Clyde and its bloodbath at the end. No one had ever really seen anything like that, and The Wild Bunch followed very quickly again with a great deal of bloodshed. And this was part of a dialogue we were having in this country in the late 60s, early 70s about how violent we really wanted our movies to be.
In theory, in those days, in the days of Sam Peckinpah, we were going to understand violence by seeing it for real. It wasn't going to be pow, death, you know, it wasn't going to be that. We were going to watch people bleed and watch people suffer and watch people's eyes being gouged out. And that was supposed to make us stop doing it.
Dirty Harry was criticized for being ultra-violent and you know, perhaps fascist cinema and all these things, that it was playing to the baser instincts of the American audience and who we really were, and did it mean that we had violence in our blood?
Yeah, at the time, it was really violent. I mean, you know, Pauline Kael's review calling it a paean to fascism.
The thing that happened in the Dirty Harry movies is that the good guys would participate in this violence and they would not show any outward reaction. And that gets translated into the viewer, particularly the critic, saying, oh, this is a cold-blooded, cruel, sadistic movie. There's not a flicker of remorse on Clint Eastwood's face when he pulls the trigger.
The criticism was that the movie glorified violence. And I don't disagree with that, in the sense that it seemed to justify the violence so that it had no other ramifications. When I saw the film, I was caught up in it, but later was like, wait, why did I enjoy that when I should have been repulsed by it and then was repulsed by it once I thought about it.
I certainly don't think it was more violent than Bonnie and Clyde or more violent than The Wild Bunch. I think maybe where people had a problem with it was a contemporary rendering of violence, and it wasn't the Old West or the 1920s.
It certainly was not as violent as the streets, and it wasn't as violent as Vietnam, and it wasn't gratuitous violence. It was in honor of following a perception of a major U.S. institution, the police. And I think Clint tried to honor the reality of that, and I think that comes out violent.
I think the big shocker scene in Dirty Harry, where he gets the serial killer and he's wounded him in the leg and he steps on that wound and torches him, making him scream as the camera swings back into this powerful helicopter shot. You know, very few scenes had ever been put on film like that before. That was good old Don Siegel, the genre filmmaker, being a tough guy.
Movies are ultimately to involve you. Sometimes they make you cry, sometimes they make you laugh, sometimes they scare the piss out of you. You know, I don't think you're supposed to walk away from seeing Dirty Harry and say, my goodness, violence is terrible. I think you're supposed to walk away from Dirty Harry saying, that was just like the best damn cop film I ever saw.
The problem with violence, as with sexuality, these are the two controversial issues always, is that once a movie is violent, the next one can only be more violent.
I don't know if it desensitizes an audience to the point where the next picture they see has to be more violent. I don't think any of the other Dirty Harrys got much more violent than that. I don't think it escalated.
Violence is a built-in problem in action movies because even movies that claim to be anti-violence, such as Unforgiven, they have to resort to a cathartic violence scene of a shootout. It's like having an anti-war movie that has brutal war sequences.
Sometimes there's terrible things that have happened in the world that have to be dramatized and have to be shown. I mean, everybody wants to watch pictures about things that have happened, and sometimes it has to be recreated.
Cinema is not there just to coddle us. It's there to reflect our views and our fears and everything that we need to think about and deal with in our lives. Violence, up there. Death, up there.
I think what violence serves in a film is to create drama.
It's like a tool. It's like anything else. It's like a musical number or a set piece or a pratfall.
I don't think you have to go to Harvard University. I don't think you have to spend millions of dollars on a study or ask a congressional committee to look into it. Any human being can answer that question for you just like that. If you put violence into the home, it's going to affect the people watching it. And the younger the people are, the more vulnerable they are, the more uncertain they are about how they're supposed to behave in life because their dad and mommy may not tell them. They're going to take their instructions from what they're watching on television.
Son of a bitch!
Richard Donner, who did the first Superman, told me after it was released that some little boy had tied a tablecloth around his neck and jumped out of the window because he thought he could fly like Superman. We see that kind of thing imitated a lot.
I think there are definitely mentally ill people out there who can be influenced by a movie because they have obsessive personalities and they can sort of obsess on a film.
Nuts have done copycat crimes after seeing cop movies. There are some terrible examples in movies like Money Train, where a booth attendant is threatened by an arson. Somebody saw that movie and went into a New York City subway station a week afterward and burned a toll booth collector.
There was a famous case with a Burt Reynolds movie in the 70s with setting bums on fire, and someone started doing that. It's hard to address. I mean, there are instances where a guy who has violence in him will get an idea based on a TV show. So that looks like fun. I think I'll try that one this week. I don't think that if that individual had been limited to only watching sitcoms, that he would then say, you know, I really don't feel like hurting anybody because all my violent impulses, they haven't been stoked by television. I mean, for Christ's sake, you know, Himmler did a hell of a job without television. I don't think that he was influenced by those little Nickelodeons and said, I'm going to go out and stage the most horrible act in human history.
If you will allow me, I will quote the great poet and philosopher Chris Rock, who was talking about the Columbine killings and how movies were being blamed and television was being blamed and video games were being blamed. And he looked at his audience and said, what about just fucking crazy?
When people look to, let's say, schoolboy killers and ask in suburban America, where could they have learned their violence if it wasn't from watching television? They miss out on the fact that many children go through the brutalization and other experiences that actually make people violent. The two boys in Littleton, Colorado, who seemed to have good parents, who weren't brutalized by their parents, turned out to have themselves, the night before they went to the school and killed everyone, made a videotape that explained why they were doing what they were doing. And one of them said, I got beat up all the times on the military bases where I lived as a boy with my father when he was in the Air Force. And the other said, I'm sick and tired of football players like my older brother beating me up all the time. There was a reason for their violence, and it wasn't from going to violent movies.
Now, there are kinds of media violence that can incite violent crime. They're nonfiction. Sporting events, political journalism about war. People will go out and do violence after they see that. But nobody watches a Dirty Harry movie and says, I must go be a vigilante cop.
I think it's nonsense that people watching a violent film will suddenly become violent. If anything, I think you work out some of the things that might make you go act out by going to see a film that has violence, so that you have a chance, at least, of playing out that fantasy and leaving satiated.
The first people to wrestle with these ideas were the critics and reviewers at the Olympics, when people don't remember, but the Olympics used to include the plays. Catharsis is when you see people go through these intense emotions. They're raised high and they're brought low. This feeling that you get, if you bond with them, frees you, and it's almost like psychoanalysis, if you kind of think about it, in that day, that you can be purged of those feelings.
Laurie. Listen, I killed him! I killed him! Stop it, Laurie, stop it!
Parents in the 18th and 19th centuries used to take their children to public executions. They did it because they said they wanted their children to see what happens to bad children. But I think you have to see those events as another kind of ecstatic group experience, however repulsive they seem to us now. As our Western culture has become less and less violent, and in fact it has, not more and more violent, we hear about it more, so perhaps it bothers us more, but the violence levels are very low. So instead of real violence, we now go to cinema, television, all the big public media for mock violence. So that has to be partly for the cathartic sense of dissolving into a group, being the bystanders who watch someone else being a hero or being punished for not being a hero, for being a criminal. It gives us a kind of solidarity with each other.
I've heard that statement that violence in cinema is cathartic. I remember the Wachowski brothers told me that. That was one of their theories, that violence was cathartic and that we shouldn't own guns. They were for gun control, but it was all right to shoot all the people we wanted on the screen because it would keep people from doing it otherwise. That's pure, undiluted bullshit.
What concerns me is is that if you want to get a catharsis out of a film, you remember Charlie's Angels? They would get these three beautiful girls and they'd have them tied up in the corner of a warehouse, and the bad guy would sit at the table cleaning his gun and say, "Did you get the package?" "Yeah, it arrives tonight with the rest of the ship." And say, "Wait a minute, you know it's not real. These girls are in no danger. If this were the real life, they'd be in serious trouble. They'd be ravaged and they'd be butchered, these girls." So you immediately say, well, if the girls get away, no big deal, because they were never in any danger anyway. But if you put someone through the mill and you really feel that they're in a violent, dangerous situation that takes you there in such a way that it's almost hurtful to watch, but then they escape, you feel the catharsis. You say, oh my God, maybe you can get out of something that bad. I mean, because they didn't cheat. They didn't cheat that the bad guys left them alone. The bad guys didn't leave them alone. And still, somehow they managed through courage or trickery or whatever to get away. I now feel a catharsis as if I've been through hell and back.
I don't think there's research to show that movie violence is cathartic in the sense that it satisfies and relieves the aggressivity. It doesn't calm people down. Movie violence doesn't relax you. It does the opposite. But neither does it make you say, you know what, I'm gonna shoot my neighbor.
Creative people have a tremendous challenge in portraying violence because we see so much of it around us in the real world that to give it another kind of dimension is a particular challenge.
The way you depict violence, stylistically on film, can have a huge impact on how it's perceived and received by the audience. If you pretty it up and have lots of bullet time and make it very choreographed and artful, I think you're placing beauty into something that shouldn't be beautiful. Whereas if it's abrupt and brutal and like a punch to the face, like lightning striking, and ugly and discordant, that's much more realistic.
I've yet to make a movie where I felt like I was mean-spiritedly going at somebody or torturing somebody or abusing somebody. That's the stuff that I have a problem with, The way someone gets shot or the amount of blood they lose or what their reaction is, that's something that's still very real and very immediate and happens. Torture chamber stuff, I think it is excessive, but at the same time, I think that those filmmakers could make just as compelling a reason why that's necessary as I can why it's unnecessary.
Making it cool, making it cool to shoot people and making light of life, which happens a lot in action films recently, where people make a wisecrack and shoot somebody over their shoulder and machine gun a whole bunch of people who fall down. That does have an effect. I mean, you see that enough and you start to think that it cheapens human life. There's no doubt about that.
There are some films that require necessary gore to root you or establish the truth of what you're watching. Steven Spielberg in Saving Private Ryan shows a guy's head pop, and just blood and brains spray everywhere because he knew he'd be cheating if he pretended that you could get through a battle like that without witnessing the sorts of sights and casualties that he presents in that movie. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, for instance, it's half romantic comedy and half thriller. It would be too much to see the blood splatter. If you don't want to see it, then just cut to the gun firing and don't show the other part. But if you are going to show it, I think you're sort of obligated to do it in a realistic way.
Well, audiences are funny about the issue of realism. Realism is always a result of a film style that was popular at the time. What counted as realism in the late 1960s or the early 70s when Dirty Harry was made is very different from what would count as realism in film violence today. In fact, if you want to get kind of esoteric, you look at a movie like The Passion of the Christ. Fundamentalist Christians go and they see realism. People who aren't fundamentalist Christians go and they see some wacko SM fantasy on screen. Well, who's right? Those are matters of opinion.
I'm talking about having our fingers in the holes and the whole damn dike's crumbling around us.
Filmmakers do have a responsibility when it comes to depicting violence.
Well, the filmmakers don't really have a responsibility to the audience, to my mind. There's no ethical responsibility.
A filmmaker's responsibility is to be as truthful to themselves and to the material as possible.
Hitchcock, when he would be asked about his responsibility, how twisted and strange and violent his films were, couldn't they affect the audience? What is your responsibility to those people out there in the dark? And Hitchcock, his whole life, carried a laminated article from the newspaper about someone who took his girlfriend to see the movie, and after the movie, took her in the alley behind the movie theater and strangled her. And the movie was Snow White.
I was approached years ago to do a film, which I decided not to do because I felt it was irresponsible. I've done that 3 or 4 times, but the one that sticks in my head was a Stephen King book called The Dead Zone. And Paramount at the time was looking to buy it, and they asked me what I thought. And I said, do we really want to make a picture that details methods of how to kill the president?
Man's got to know his limitations.
I would hope that the violence that I've depicted in the work that I've done is repulsive. I take my responsibility very seriously that I don't want to ever appear as if I'm advocating violence. The number of people who have said to me, both in prison and outside of prison, that the thing they liked about Oz was that it was a cautionary tale as opposed to anything that would encourage someone to say, wow, that was cool the way that happened. It's not like the bad guy has to suffer. On Oz, what it was you had to show the effect of evil on society in general.
You can make a very salacious film. You can make a film that deals with sex, deals with violence in a gratuitous way, and so that people think there are no consequences to these things. That, I think, does a disservice to everybody. You look at the Iraq War and how you'll never see images on television of our GIs being shot or their bodies or anything. We say, no, it's a war and here's the statistics, but the statistics are very dry and there's these many people dead and these many people wounded. But, you know, see the pictures of those men and 5 men dead, 2 men dead, 1 man or woman dead, it would be a shocking thing. I think that movies that make that link, they do us a great service.
The one thing I will disagree with about violence in cinema is where they give you a specific bit of information about how to make someone suffer.
Why do you make me do it? You know you're gonna talk. I'm gonna make you talk.
There are films where a detective in describing will give some way that people can be strangled or some way that's particularly torturous for the victim. And I don't think that you necessarily need that information to get out there.
The problem with trying to impose a constraint on a filmmaker is that different members of the audience are going to take any movie in different ways. So you can try to choreograph your violence to induce a certain effect, and you know what? Half the audience is going to have the opposite response. Some people will look at a scene from Dirty Harry and think, this is terrible, vigilantism ought to be stopped. Other people will look at the same scene and say, that's great, we need more vigilantism. And there's nothing that the filmmaker can do about that.
I never said they use violence.
But what'd you want me to do, yell trick or treat at him?
Government would prefer to blame television and film for all that is wrong with the planet, as opposed to really looking at the issues involved and why crime exists and why violence exists.
Like most writers and directors and different people that work in the film industry, I really don't want a bureaucrat deciding what should or should not be seen.
Back in the day, we had the Hayes office, which had a code of what you could depict in film and what you couldn't depict in film, and that was sort of a quasi-governmental office.
When you think back to the 30s and 40s where you couldn't have a love scene on a bed without a guy having his 1 foot on the floor. Even married couples slept in double beds.
These days, we have the MPAA, which is the film industry self-regulating and self-policing itself.
The feeling about the rating board is that with all the problems, it's better that the regulation will be done by the Motion Picture Association rather than by a central agency out of Washington, D.C., or worse, various religious and political groups in different parts of the country.
We police ourselves sometimes not because we are sincere about caring about it, but more because we don't want them coming to get us.
Come out with your hands up, the man says.
How do you like that, Ma? Here's my answer, you dirty...
Was it 3 years ago when they were going to have a congressional thing and they were going to investigate violence in the movies? I said to my wife, you watch what's going to happen. Starting next fall, you're going to see a slight reduction, at least in violence on television. But guess what's going to take its place? Tits and ass.
I remember doing $1 Million Baby and that coming out, and the right wing pointing to Clint. And it's like, well, you see, it's the reason why there's, so many people who want to commit suicide or whatever, or, or this whole euthanasia thing, which is rotting our society. It's because of movies like that. They love to grab a little piece of media for themselves, and nothing's easier than attacking a movie or a celebrity or someone whom like Clint, who is such a high profile.
It's an easy dog to kick, Who's going to say, no, I want violence, I want to corrupt our children?
In every era, with every kind of art form, from the novel forward, there have always been people who have cried out publicly, this is wrong. And they've often been people who had some fig leaf of official status that justified their somehow being authorities in the matter, even though perhaps they didn't even read those novels or watch those television shows. Their job is partly self-promoting, but they also, I think, recognize that modern mass media, in many ways, has replaced a lot of traditional institutions as the source of moral values.
How many times has there been a lawsuit? Someone says, my son robbed that liquor store and took drugs because of the album he was listening to. And people have actually tried to file lawsuits over these things, and they're invariably quashed at the earliest stage.
To say, well, we still want art, but just not the violent parts of it, is ludicrous. Even if in a given instance, it seems obvious that a film is obscene, then don't see it. Or don't let your kids see it. But if you start to censor and ban what can be filmed, then what's next? What other elements of art are we going to... No female nudity in painting? No homosexual imagery in art? The government, if they're watching this, take a hike.
We have something in the United States of America called the First Amendment. It protects expression. Mock violence in media is one kind of expression.
There's the problem. There's where you get defeated. There's where you reach the point that Dirty Harry reaches. What do you do to stop the violence when the legal system cannot do it? What do you do when the law will not allow you, and the democratic ideal and all will not allow you to say to a movie company or a television company, you can't show that, that's too violent? Who said so?
And who are those people that they think they should tell the rest of us what we feel and what we see and what we believe?
It's not just a question of whether or not to use violence. There simply is no other way, Inspector.
Film has power, but it does not dictate violence, because violence is who we are. I try to fight it in myself. We all try to combat within ourselves a sense of hatred, prejudice, spite, schadenfreude. But the best way to combat it is to acknowledge it and move beyond it, and use sense, and use decency, so you come from a place of love instead of a place of fear. The way to deal with the fear part of it is to go to the movies. Go to a scary movie, deal with your fear there. Then when you're out of the movie, come home and come from a place of love. I don't think I would ever want to hurt anybody, but I will want to always see that bad guy get blown the fuck out of his socks by the end of the film. And then I feel better. Now I don't have to go hit somebody.